This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Good afternoon. Today we continue looking primarily at the post-exilic period. I'm going to come back a little bit next week. I just want to talk a little bit more about the exile next week, but I want to stay on schedule. And we did mostly Assyria last week, so even though it won't be exactly chronological, I'm going to just spend about 15 or so minutes next week on Babylon. But before I do, today, since we have on this topic, and I know you have that schedule, and we want to make sure that we cover this. I just filmed in, I guess it was January, for National Geographic on the Greeks, and in particular, my area was on Alexander the Great. And I've often found Alexander to be one of the most enigmatic people in history. Not many people really deserve the epithet great. It's sort of alarming, and as we'll talk about today a bit, that Herod gets that moniker too. But Alexander, if anybody deserves it, Alexander falls in that same company as Cyrus. And I'm not going to say Frederick, but definitely you could add, some do, Constantine, but maybe for not always appropriate reasons. Today we'll look at the net result of Alexander as well, and that's what we call Hellenism. Now, you know that Hellas, Hellas, is the way the Greeks referenced their region, Hellas, and they called themselves Hellenes. Today, of course, if you go to Greece, and I just returned a few months ago, I guess we look at the Republic of the Hellenes. That's one of the names for Greece today, not Greece, but Hellas. And Hellenism is a different term that actually describes the result of the Macedonians and Greeks going to Asia Minor and then across Asia. And what happened, the net effect of Westerners going east is they brought back a lot of the East with them. And Alexander himself certainly seems to have become much more of the Oriental despot at the end of his life. He really changed greatly. And although Plutarch claims that he was very much someone who took self-control at a very high priority, I think if we recognize Alexander as a great conqueror, it seems he failed to conquer himself at the end. And a year ago now plus, when I was speaking at the University of Tehran as a guest, an academic guest in Iran, I made a comment, and the audience of about several thousand Iranians, mostly academics, almost cheered when I said this, that we all know that Alexander conquered Persia. That's a given in the world. I said, but more people need to know that Persia also conquered Alexander. And you can read about that, the end of his life and the debates about whether he died a natural death, although he certainly was dissipating his way there. But Hellenism, then, we wouldn't have without Alexander having gone to the east. And the armies that came back, not just the Macedonians, but all those who came back, mercenary Greeks, and came back with a lot of attendants, and Persians and Babylonians and other Easterners. What happened was a mixture of Eastern ideas, mathematics, science, the whole world of the cosmos was a very narrow place in Greek purview. But by the time Alexander died and the Greeks came back home from those final wars with Darius III and conquest, it changed everything for them. They were no longer isolated Greeks. Even the term barbarian could no longer really be applied. As you know, Barbaros, although the name Barbara, be careful, it means bearded one. Barbaros, though, really originally meant people who couldn't speak Greek because they kind of went bar, 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 bar. They were incoherent, inarticulate. And that changed. You were no longer a barbarian if you didn't speak Greek or if you weren't Greek. The whole concept of Greekness changed dramatically because of Alexander. So let's go there. And I'm sure many of you have been to the Museo Nazionale in Napoli, the archaeological museum, and you've seen this famous mosaic, of which this is just a very small detail here. And this mosaic is actually, you can see the tiny little tessera, but there are 1 million tiles, 1 million tessera. It's probably the most expensive mosaic ever commissioned. It was in the House of the Faun in Pompeii, and now it's up on the wall in Naples. But it's an incredible mosaic, and it doesn't have to be realistic because it's several hundred years after the fact. We don't even know if Alexander had brown hair. Many say he had blonde hair and green eyes, like other Macedonians. But there are many details that probably aren't so important. Nonetheless, let's take a look, because there are circumstances surrounding Alexander and what happened, even in that tiny little corner of the world called Judea, that were world-changing. Now, even in the Middle Ages, Alexander was highly, highly regarded. Here you see that as time goes, legends grow too. And there's been a pushback in the last half century against Alexander, so that many people call it Alexander mania, or they call it essentially a cult of worship around Alexander, which he may have even indeed stirred, wanted to happen. But here, a Roman, several hundred years after the fact, wrote the deeds of Alexander the Great. You can see this from the Royal Budapest Library around 1400, and you can just see at the top where it's talking about Quintus Curtius Rufus' history and battles of Alexander the Great, and this is the beginning of Book 3. So the legend was indeed amazing. Even in his own lifetime, Alexander wanted people to believe, and he wanted to hear that he was a god, which wasn't so Greek. It was really unusual. The Greeks very much looked down philosophically on megalomania. The Greeks were not happy to see someone who went beyond the limits and borders of what was considered human. In fact, there were a lot of people in Alexander's own day who saw his hubris as really beyond belief. But nobody could have done what Alexander did, given the fact of the circumstances, which we're going now to discuss. So here you can look at what the Persian Empire appeared to be. This is under Darius Hydaspes, the successor a few after Cyrus. And you can see in this map the extent of what Cyrus had accomplished. So all the way to the Indus River, what would today be essentially Pakistan, all the way up, if you think of the in these areas of the Caucasus and the Elbrus Mountains. This, we'll remember, was the ancient area of Urartu. The Assyrians didn't even get this far. All of Asia Minor, in fact, even across into Thrace, Scudra, and down the Levant, the big empty desert area here, and then down into Egypt and all the way to Cyrene. So this was essentially what Darius inherited. He didn't really conquer all that. Cyrus had done the main bulk of that conquest. And then you had this great royal road going from Susa all the way to Sardis. There's so many things we could talk about the Persians and their achievements, but many things that later cultures have tried to take credit for. The Persians really got there first. I'm not going to go into detail, but Cyrus really was someone who deserved that title, the epithet Cyrus the Great. So Darius succeeds him after Cambyses II, after a small period. You all know that Darius was he was royal to begin with, but he wasn't necessarily the first in line after Cyrus's blood successor died, but he was close enough in bloodline to claim it. It's said that a Persian king has to be the one who, when the sun rises over the crest of the mountains, that horse of that king-to-be neighs first. So the whinny of a horse at the rising sun is a sign of conferring the kingship. And Darius worked out with his groom a way to make that happen. You probably know the story, but Herodotus tells us, and others do too, that the groom, who was fairly crafty and knew horses really well, knew that Darius' stallion was a great horse, and so he brought a mare in heat to the stallion, and then took a rag and rubbed it all over the parts of the mare, all those pheromones, and then tied it to the nose of the stallion, who just went wild. You're just, leaping up and down and so on. And so then the groom took the rag away, and 2 days later was the ceremony when all the princes, all the noble houses of the Persians would arrive there at dawn, assembled with their horses. And so what the groom did was he waited and timed it just right, and he was close enough to the horse that he had that rag tucked in his, somewhere in his whatever tunic. And he checked the wind direction, and then he was standing a few feet away, and just just before that first gleam of light hit, like a few split seconds before, he brought the rag out at the right wind, and the horse just roared and leaped in the air with a huge whinny. And everybody said, "Oh, Darius, clearly, you are to be king." This is the way history really happens. Yes? To demystify kingship and so on. How you can manipulate and maneuver legend. But Alexander did a fair bit of that himself. Now, the Persians, of course, have you've probably read the plays of the Greeks, the tragedies, and so on. Even the ghost of Darius is unhappy with his son Xerxes in Aeschylus's play in the Persians. When the Athenians side with Ionia and attack Sardis and so on, Xerxes comes over to Greece, and we have the Greco-Persian Wars. and the burning of the temple of Athena Polias in Athens and so on, whose embers and burnt rocks the Greeks left for almost 50 years to remind themselves of the perfidy of the Persians. Well, you have, of course, the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, eventually the Battle of Salamis and Plataea, and the Persians are sent home packing. Xerxes goes back home with his tail between his legs. But then you have a continuing relationship with the mercenaries, the Greeks who are still in Asia Minor, particularly on the west coast of Anatolia. And eventually, Alexander is going to muster enough Greek energy for payback, to pay back Xerxes and for the Greco-Persian Wars and so on. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story. This was the mega empire of the world at the time. And the Persians were not as heavy-handed as even the Babylonians, certainly not as heavy-handed as the Assyrians. They set up 120 satrapies, governors, satraps in all those provinces. Literally, if Herodotus is right, the Battle of Marathon, when Herodotus says in 490 BCE that the Greeks fought at Marathon, and you could maybe muster a total of 25,000 Attic soldiers, and you could get maybe 30 total if you brought the Plataeans in. But 30,000 Greeks fighting what may have been 100,000 Persians, since Herodotus says the Greeks at Marathon fought 46 nations, meaning all the different satrapies, the different peoples of the Persian Empire. Whatever the case, now, Persia is still the big elephant in the room, the huge shadow over Greece. And Greece is very, very fragmented in the 4th century. And let's look at what happens under Philip. Now, here, you've probably been and seen these at the Louvre or elsewhere. There's still a few in Tehran that I saw a year ago. But the 10,000 immortals of Darius were these warriors who were considered the cream of the crop, the very best fighters possible. And there was a very strong core of Persian fighters who were very well trained. Of course, there were also, in any given Persian army, if you had 10,000 immortals, you also had 90,000 raw recruits who were probably also mercenaries. So the bulk of Persian armies were not necessarily like these 10,000 immortals, the royal guard, as it were. Here, around 350, since Alexander was born a few years before, 356, this is Persian territory here. The satrapies of Caria, Lydia, and Sardis is ruled essentially by a cousin of the King of Kings, of Darius. And here, Greece, which in the Peloponnesian Wars was basically the division of Attic and Athenians against Spartans and so on. This was very, very problematic for Greece because it was city-state ruled. City-states don't make an empire. Yes, there was the Delian League before that Athens sort of ruled over, but for the most part, the Greeks did not even see eye to eye with their own Greek neighbors. So there was no idea of unity at the time. Now, Alexander, as I said, born in 356, doesn't live very long, as you can see. If you live to 33, that's pretty astonishing given the hardships of his life. But these are the sources we have for Alexander. This was sort of a hagiographer, a camp writer who went with the campaigns of Alexander. And we're not going to dismiss what he says, but we have to take it with a grain of salt because it's an official biographer who goes with Alexander, and therefore it may not be as credible. Diodorus Siculus is later, several centuries. Quintus Curtius Rufus, so you have a Greek and a Roman. Then, of course, Plutarch, who's probably the best source in his parallel lives, the Bioi Paralleloi, where he writes with enormous detail. And he was a scholar, plus Plutarch had the advantage of being the high priest at Delphi. So very much, I would say, a very, very good source. Then our later sources, Arrian and Diogenes later. But you can see we're getting further and further from the life of Alexander, which was a 4th century life. Now, given that the day he was born, something happened dramatically. This is one of the 7 wonders of the world, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Today there's maybe 1 column left standing, and that's even by John Turtle Wood been reassembled in the 19th century in the British Museum expedition, but only one column of the 120 columns, 60 plus feet high. So this was a huge, huge temple, a wonder of the world, and even Pliny calls it the magnificence of Greece. But what happened the day Alexander was born? The temple burned down. The original temple burned down. Now there were 3, the second one burned down. Alexander was born the 6th of Hecatombion, which month the Macedonians call Lus, the same day that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus was burnt, which Hegesias of Magnesia, he was a demagogue, an orator, a rhetor, makes the occasion of a conceit. The temple, he says, took fire and was burnt while its mistress was absent, assisting at the birth of Alexander. Artemis was the goddess of childbirth. And so the Greeks said, the temple burned down because she left to help Alexander's birth in Macedonia. It's a coincidence, but it's interesting. Plutarch says, and all the eastern soothsayers who happened to be then at Ephesus, looking upon the ruin of this temple to be the forerunner of some other calamity, ran about the town, beating their faces and crying that this day had brought forth something that would prove fatal and destructive to all Asia. Now, of course, that's considered foreshadowing, isn't it? Plutarch's clearly writing this in, inserting this to show that, yes, what was going to happen was Alexander was going to conquer Asia. But isn't it interesting? Now, we know the person who burned it down was just looking for notoriety. He wanted infamy, a bit like people today who do terrible things to get their 15 seconds. But here, the coincidence of being the same day Alexander was born was made to be something very omenic and prophetic. And Alexander also amped up this talk in his lifetime. He liked the fact that the temple of Artemis burned down on his birthday, the day of his birth. So, literally. Now, let's look at the occasion of his family. Philip II of Macedon was not really a blue blood. He was a war leader. He spent more time in the saddle than out. In essentially 25 years of warring, he was a rough man, and while he was somewhat, he was certainly literate and cultured so far as it goes, but he was not the person who was legitimately the ruler of Macedon. The person he married, it was a forced marriage. Olympias was of the royal house of Macedon, his wife, and she apparently hated him. They did not get on well at all. But she claimed that the night Alexander was conceived, Philip came in from some campaign, smelling like a horse as usual, and that while he tried to force himself upon her, the real visitor that night was the god Dionysus who came and impregnated her. And so she claimed for really her whole life afterwards that Philip's Philip's claim that Alexander was his son wasn't true. That Alexander was the son of a god, not the son of Philip. Well, you may have read Mary Renault's book about that. I'm not sure anybody would take easily to the bed of Olympias. She was high-strung. We're told that she had big snakes in her bed, too. Literally. Read Mary Renault on this. She was quite a woman. And she was also a priestess of the god Dionysus, the high priestess of the literal, the cult of Dionysus, the local cult. Well, anyway, Philip didn't really tolerate her very well either. But here's what Greece looked like before Philip. Now, that's essentially Old Macedonia, with the Paeonia and Agriania, northern. Today, you're talking basically about the real Macedonia. But Greece proper today runs pretty close to this, right along in here. And then notice that what happened, this is proper Greece, and then Greece began to occupy some of this. So this is in 359, it's pretty fragmented. And of course, Thrace, which is under the control mostly of the Persian Empire as a vassal state. But by the time Philip dies, literally in 336, that's what he does. He unifies Greece. Now, he doesn't ever take Sparta, as you can see. But these are client kingdoms. And then, of course, Philip is assassinated by one of his guards. And many of the rumors of the day, whether substantiated or not, suggest that Olympias arranged his death in anger because he'd remarried a young 18-year-old girl named Cleopatra, and she was basically pregnant. So Olympias did not want Philip's new wife to basically dethrone her. But there's so many competing stories here. But Alexander by now is 18 years old, and he is proclaimed the successor. Cleopatra, his sort of stepmother, 18-year-old stepmother, his age doesn't survive either. And they're both put into a tomb together. So you have a lot of animosity, natural animosity. And what is Alexander going to do? Alexander, if you read Alexander's life, you have different versions of this. But his father, Philip, had been not happily welcomed to Greece because he was a Macedonian. He wasn't Greek. Furthermore, Demosthenes preached against Philip for years from the porches, the back porches of several Greek temples, including at Olympia and Athens. And so Demosthenes, the demagogue and orator, wrote his Philippics against Philip, against the travesty of Philip as a potential ruler. Not a Greek, said Demosthenes, but now Philip unifies Greece. And in the process of doing so, he has to leave something for his son Alexander. What is it going to be? What will Alexander be able to do? Can Alexander unify all these Greeks in ways that Philip cannot? But let's again go back a bit. One of the great things that Philip had going for him was an improved phalanx fighting. This phalanx, this unit of men. Remember, you have phalanges, yes? Phalanges, the plural of phalanx. They have to operate together, don't they? A phalanx has to operate. Phalanges have to operate in unison together to make things work. The little finger can't be opposed to the big finger and thumb and so on. But a phalanx is a very tight fighting unit. And what made Philip's units even more formidable was these sarissa spearmen. Now, a sarissa is a spear that can literally be up to 6 meters long. Usually not. Usually 4 meters is the average. But can you imagine having a spear that's 20 feet long? Anybody who's going to come at you, you can impale before they get there. And also, the way they run with these spears, they run with them raised and then only bring them down to engage so they don't get in their way. They're actually often cornel wood or a hard wood, and they're 2 pieces screwed together with a cap. But in any case, this Sarissa phalanx unit aided Philip immensely in his conquest of Greece, a new fighting tool. Now, Philip, let's go back a bit. Philip, the name Philip, as you know, Phil hippos means lover of horses or lover of horse. Hippos is horse, Phil, love. And he was, in his own day, younger. He was a great rider, and no doubt he smelled like a horse because he was always around horses more than people. And he won at Olympia in the chariot race. He had his surrogate racing for him in the chariot, but he also raced on horseback. And he had several victory coins to commemorate his victories at both Olympia and elsewhere. So he really was a great horseman. And the cavalry of Philip was, again, intimidating, a wonderful cavalry. Now, this is what he erected beginning in 337, 338, a few years before he was assassinated. He began to erect a monument for himself. It's a round thalos. That's my picture of it just a few months ago. Not much left, and it's been rebuilt. Here's where it was, literally, in the sacred enclosure with the temple of Zeus, the temple of Hera, and so on, and the mound of Pelops and the shrine of Pelops, and then the great stadium out here, and so on. And, Palystra Gymnasium, and so on. But Philip didn't finish his monument, so Alexander did. Alexander had this monument, the Philippian, finished. And here's the big mound at Olympia, again taken in March. So the Philippian is right over here, and what's left of the temple of Hera, and so on. And right there is the altar, which, as you know, a few weeks ago, the Olympic torch was relit, as it is every Olympic tetrad year. So here's his mother, Olympias, and as I said, and this is a very small portion of a gold coin. And we don't know, again, if that's really Olympias, because this was issued later by the Romans. But it doesn't matter if it's her likeness. As I said, she was a piece of work. Not just because she was the high priestess of a Theosos of Dionysus. She literally worshipped this god. And this is the god of wine, the god of tragic drama, the god of spontaneity, the god of chaos, the god of freedom. And it goes well with the Macedonian mindset of independence. So this was a god that also took the form of a bull, took the form of a goat, took the form of a leopard or panther. You can see the panther skin around his neck. And he's also the god of uncontrollable things, vines. You see the ivy around his head? Anybody ever be able to get rid of ivy? Good luck. This is a god who can't be controlled. Perfectly appropriate for Olympias, who couldn't be controlled either. So good luck, Philip. Now, as a high priestess, we're pretty sure this was her bronze volute crater as part of her priestess liturgical role. And a friend of mine has published a book on this, the Derveni crater. Beryl Sherar has published this. So it's gilded, it's bronze, but gilded. And it's all about Dionysiac ritual. As you can see on it, here are maenads, the sacred attendants of Dionysus, dancing. And they're pretty, shall we say, engaged. Do you see the vine leaf right here around them? They're tendrils waiting to cling to something. So vines, and then here's another part of it. Here's a maenad who's sleeping off the effects of too many craters of wine. And again, here you see ivy with ivy balls, and that's supposed to be a panther. But this, as I said, belonged to her. Now, the first apparently 6 years of his life, Alexander was basically clinging to his mother's skirts. That's a picture I just took in the Acropolis Museum. But young Alexander was fed for the first 6 years of his life, not just with his mother's milk, he was fed this idea, you're not Philip's son, you're the son of a god. You're the son of Dionysus. And essentially also because it could be bull and thunder together, Zeus too. So it wasn't just enough to be the son of Dionysus. So she fed him this, and she really made his little boy ego pretty insufferable. And you can imagine Philip finally comes home from the wars, and he sees his son and says to Olympias, what is this this effeminate child is not mine. What have you done? You've ruined my boy. So Philip took Alexander away from Olympias. And that would be pretty unforgivable too, wouldn't it? Anyway, we'll get to this. But for the next few years, probably into his early adolescence, Alexander was trained under a Macedonian who was thoroughly and rigorously trained himself by the Spartans. Now his name was Leonidas, but he's not Leonidas the Spartan. He's Leonidas the Macedonian who looks, walks, acts, and thinks like a Spartan. And what Alexander was forced to do for the next few years was to live austerely. He had to steal his own food. He had to sleep out in the rain. He had to walk barefoot in winter in the snow. Philip really toughened him up. And that was important to balance out, to counteract what he felt was Olympias' influence on Alexander. Now, there were a set of Macedonian nobles that were trained with Alexander, and they became the core of his companions. But they were all trained under this rigorous austerity. So Alexander became tough as nails and could endure cold, hunger, heat. This was vital for later years. He learned that pain was something to be overcome. So really tough Alexander now. But do you ever erase those first 6 years? Remember, 3 years and you're formed. So he still is thinking, what? Inside. I'm a god. I'm the son of a god. Well, this is an interesting combination. To believe you're a god, or at least to think that if people tell you you're a god, like your mother, and whatever his father told him, probably to offset this, I think Alexander still harbors in his psyche this belief in himself. So that would kind of make you hard to stop, wouldn't it? If you thought you were a god. Wouldn't you be, talk about entitlement? Now, I have some pretty entitled students at Stanford. They're nothing like this. All right? So now you're tough as possible, but you still believe you're a god. Or at least you're told and think that this could be true. What happens next? Well, Alexander has this huge ego still, and he now is not somebody you want to wrestle with physically, but Philip says, okay, now it's time to train the mind. So what Philip did was he looked around and he found the best philosopher, tutor, scholar in the world and said, come, and that was Aristotle. So for the next few years, Aristotle is Alexander's private tutor. So what does Alexander now get? A razor-sharp mind. He's taught logic. He's taught strategy. And of course, Philip begins after that to take him to learn military strategy in battles too. Now, what I'm going to say with this combination, believing you're a god from your mother, imbibing with her milk that idea, tough as nails, thanks to Spartan austerity, and now with a razor-sharp mind, how could you not conquer the world? Especially if you're Philip's son who's just conquered Greece. Pretty good legacy, yes, he inherits? All right, well, we'll come back to this. Now, he learned all about battle and strategy and how to fight, and certainly he was taught to memorize the Iliad by Aristotle. He could memorize whole passages and recite them. So he learned all about the heroes. He learned about Achilles. He learned about how heroes are driven, and so on. Maybe how heroes could have a dangerous side to them too. But anyway, now Philip is assassinated, as I mentioned, and he's placed in the royal tombs, if you know, near Thessaloniki. There was a long debate whether or not Tomb 2 at Vergina really was Philip's. It's now verified. The tomb that Philip was in had a lot of grave goods that were royal Macedonian, and new evidence has come out, very good forensic evidence. You know that a few years before, fighting the Thracians and so on, Philip had had a very bad leg injury on his left leg, and a spear had gone through, killed his horse too. He was thrown from the horse, and he had ankylosis of the knee, and the grave that turned out to be Philip's there at Vergina has a knee with exactly the damage that's described in history. Plus, there are plenty of other evidences to show it. And in that tomb, too, for a long time people thought the Greaves, the shin guards, because one was shorter than the other, that one was Philip's. It turns out that Cleopatra, the new bride, 18 years old, also had a leg injury. And the Greaves were made for her, and that's a Scythian bow case there. But it turned out that in this one tomb were Philip's remains and his bride, 18 years old, and the infant. So everything fits. Now, look at some of the grave goods. Here's a diadem. Now that may have been something that Philip stole from his wife Olympias, because that's a Dionysian. Do you see the satyr head on it? In any case, that was in Philip's tomb. And that's his larnax. That's the box of ashes and bones with the Royal Macedonian star on the top. So I think it's safe to say now that we're fairly certain that those are Philip's remains. Now, Alexander, this formidable character, this is one of Plutarch's comments. He wanted to unify the Greeks, and he felt the way to unify the Greeks was to remind them in this mantra of what the Persians had done to them. Instead of focusing on his Macedonian identity, he talked to the whole Greeks about going after the Persians. So he unified Greece to go to war. Along the way, this is one of the stories, he went to the Delphic oracle. And this is what Plutarch says. When the priestess of the oracle of Delphi refused to see him because it was not the appointed day, he went himself, taking hold of her arm, dragged her to the prophetic seat, upon which she angrily exclaimed, "You cannot be stopped, can you?" Alexander was satisfied with this accidental retort as the official utterance. I can't be stopped. I'm unstoppable. Will I conquer the world? That's a picture I just took at Delphi a few months ago. Now, and I wish I could turn these lights off in front. Are they bothering you? No, yes? Does that help? Okay, maybe even more. Is that even better? Okay, maybe that's not good. I hope that's better. All right. Now, you need to see the pictures, not me. Now, so Xerxes, remember, just to remind ourselves, Xerxes campaigns 499 to 80 in first here in Asia Minor, and then coming over to Marathon, and then to Thermopylae, and then Plataea and the Battle of Salamis. Eventually, the Persians were pushed back, were repelled. But this is what Alexander told the rest of the Greeks. We're going there. They came here. Now we're going to go there. And he also made it to be, since he was so, yes, he was full of himself, but he was so full of the Iliad, he said, we're going to go like the ancient Greeks did to Troy. We're going to take back Asia Minor. We're going to take back this area. So one of the first things they did was cross the Dardanelles, the Hellespont. Now here's Alexander as Heracles. He imagined that like a son of Zeus, he was a Heraclean hero reborn. Sigrid, are you here today? Because you just showed me a nice pendant coin that you have of this very identity. There's Alexander with the lion skin of Heracles behind it. It's one of those Athenian silver coins minted from... this is not an Athenian coin, it's an Alexander coin, but remember that the great silver mines of Laurion had indeed turned out a lot of silver. Now here you can see Alexander on his horse Bucephalus, which means ox-headed. Bos, ox. Bu is of the ox. Cephalus, head. And this was a horse that Philip had actually found when he was still alive and Alexander was a young boy. Somewhere between 11 to 13, this horse, this huge, beautiful, but wild horse, had killed a groom, a stable boy, and they had it penned in, and the horse was really wild, and nobody felt it could be tamed. Well, Philip didn't see Alexander slip into the corral and walked right over to the horse and stroked its nose and calmed it down. And everybody was astonished at this. Who is this who can tame this wild killer horse? Well, what Alexander had done was he had noticed while watching through the corral that the horse kept turning away from its shadow. And he found out that the horse was afraid of its shadow, so when he came to it, he turned the horse around so it wouldn't see its shadow. And that's how he tamed it and got up on its back. So this was his great horse that went for years with him in battles in Asia Minor. But the things that Plutarch says about Philip and about Alexander are very telling. So here's what Plutarch says. After Alexander tamed Bucephalus, Philip said to Alexander, "My son, look for a kingdom equal and worthy to yourself, for Macedonia is too little for you." Now, of course, we're told Alexander considered it more kingly to govern himself than to conquer his enemies. That's true in the early part of his campaigns, not at the end. And then when Alexander, talk about big ego, when Alexander was chided for refusing to compete in the foot races of the great games of Olympia, he laughed and said, "Why? For it is already a foregone conclusion that I would win." Isn't that, telling? That's a big ego. It's funny because we were there at Olympia in March, and we raced. A whole bunch of us raced together, and I quoted Alexander in this. Not because somebody said, "Aren't you going to run too?" I actually did run. But I did, yeah. I wasn't going to lose. Are you kidding? Not for telling that story. But I paid for it for 2 weeks. But anyway. But here's Plutarch on Alexander. Pardon? No. I was not by any means the youngest. I was actually the oldest. But anyway, I used to race. But anyway, here is his campaigns. And so Alexander crossed into Troy, and we'll talk about that in a minute, came down several battles, as you can see here, the Granicus and Issus, then, and of course, came down to all the way down the coast of, also Gaugamela, and then eventually all the way over to India with King Porus. But this took, as you can understand, this took 13 years. But let's look first at Troy. What did he do? So here, crossing the Dardanelles, the Hellespont. This is a picture I took of the Dardanelles, the Hellespont from Çanakkale. And you can see it's not even 3 miles across at that point. You can actually see a big statue at Gallipoli from the strait. So when he crossed over, Alexander, in his boat, wanted to make sure that he was the first out of the boat. But before he stepped out of the boat, in the sort of waves, he jumped out of the boat. He first threw his spear. And he took his spear and he threw it out from the water, and it landed because he said, "Now I claim Asia." And then he jumped out after it, the first ashore, and took claim to take Asia. And he went very quickly to Troy. Why? Because that's what Achilles had done. These are some pictures I took at Troy, known as Wilusa to the Hittites, ancient Wilusa. Wilusa drops the W in Mycenaean linear B as well and becomes Ilios, hence the Iliad. Troy is a much later name. But at Troy, he visited the so-called tomb of Achilles, the other great hero whom he felt that he was destined to be like. So then he came to Gordian. You've all heard the story of the Gordian knot. This is interesting. A mathematician tied a cart to a pillar in the central platea of Gordion. And the mathematician tied this knot so complicated and intricately that you couldn't see where the ends were tucked in. And it was said that whoever loosened this knot would be the conqueror of Asia. Well, somebody must have told Alexander this. So he came up, strode up to this knot, and looked it over. And he thinks outside the box, thanks to Aristotle. So he said, whoever loosens this knot, the Greek verb to loosen, loosein. It's kind of ambiguous how you loosen things. So he took out his sword, whack. He loosened it. And people said, oh, well, I guess that works. So Alexander and the Gordian knot. He solved that conundrum and just added to his legend about prophecy about being unstoppable and to conquer the world. Now, this is the great Battle of Issus on the coast, just 7 miles north of Iskenderun, Turkey, on the just above Syria today. And this is that famous mosaic I mentioned. Even though it's incomplete, here you can see Alexander, and here you can see Darius III. And just in detail, there's Alexander's so-called portrait, wearing more of a Roman breastplate and so on, with sort of a gorgon on the cover of it. It's not necessarily a likeness by any means, but he often did fight without a helmet on, which is dangerous, obviously. But here on the other side is Darius, and we even have a Persian dying here, looking at his reflection in death in the mirrored shield. So it's this great mosaic, probably the best mosaic in the world, certainly the most famous. But even though it's 200 plus years after the fact, here's another description of that battle, the great Albrecht Altdorfer in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, which looks like a battle for the world. It looks like the whole cosmos is engaged, sun and moon, and the whole curve of the earth in this Renaissance painting. You can see the world spreading out to the horizon. And down in here, you can actually see Darius and Alexander. So we look at close-ups. Here's Alexander right here. You can see it says Alexandrus Magnus. And then here is Darius fleeing the battle, which he did. So, in fact, he left everything behind, including his wife and children and mother-in-law and so on. But here again, Alexander with Heracles and Zeus imagery. So Heracles on the obverse of this Greek coin. On the back, you can see it says Alexandru. Sometimes it says Alexandru Basileus, King Alexander. And here's Zeus with his eagle on his throne. Now, Alexander went down the coast to Phoenicia and conquered Tyre, and the way he did it was remarkable. the Phoenicians ruled the seas, certainly the Mediterranean. They were formidable merchants on water, and they were great navigators. They could go by night. And Tyre now, if you look at it, Tyre is this city on an isthmus. But before Alexander, it was an island. And what Alexander did, you can see all the silt has built up. What Alexander did, he went out to this rocky island, Sur. He built a causeway to it. The Tyrians refused to acknowledge him, and so they said, you can't take us. We're impregnable. So that's what he did. He built a mole, a rock mole out to it, which took months to do. And literally, they had to have shields, huge testudo shields over them as they brought this rock sort of jetty out all the way to Tyre. So now, of course, the sands over thousands of years have built up a huge sand wall, and now there's a whole city of Tyre extends over that mole. But when Alexander's siege of Tyre was successful, when he took Tyre through that rock jetty, through the mole, he again proved that he would conquer the world, conquer Asia, because it was said, whoever could conquer Tyre will conquer the world. It was considered an impregnable place. Well, he went on down, as I mentioned, and came to Jerusalem, and the people of Jerusalem, literally, they had been put back. Remember, Cyrus let the Jews go back to Jerusalem, essentially somewhere around 535 or so BCE, and you can read the Ezra and Nehemiah accounts, and there was a little bit of bad blood between those who'd intermarried in the meantime and became Samaritans, but Cyrus even sent them back with money to rebuild their temple, and sent them back with goods that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen. So you've probably seen the great Cyrus cylinder. If not, I'll show you a picture next week. But I don't want to get too ahead. The people of Jerusalem opened their gates to Alexander. They did not resist him. They no doubt had heard what had happened at Tyre, because he ransacked that city and slaughtered the people, many of the people who fought against him. Alexander, though, had a policy of not slaughtering people if at all possible. His object was to be welcomed as ruler, not to have to fight his way through. And he probably offered pretty good terms for people who didn't resist. And he went all the way to Egypt, and we have this famous story about how he crossed from the coast all the way to the oasis of Siwa, through the desert, which was considered uncrossable. And he didn't take a whole lot of soldiers with him, but probably some died on the way. It's 80 miles to cross the desert. And you can imagine running out of water. Alexander probably crawled through the door of the oracle of Ammon. But he asked the oracle of Ammon, am I a god? Am I the son of a god? And the oracle priest wisely said, well, you must be, because nobody else could cross this desert. So you must be a god. So now he takes on the oracle of Ammon's ram horns on his coins. Now, interestingly, the Greek word for child in the neuter, paidion, neuter because you haven't expressed your gender yet. You're a paidion. But he also made a play on words. Pi dios, also pi is a diminutive for child of a god, pi dios. So he utilized that. Now, he built, or he had started in Alexandria on an island off the coast, this city. He laid the groundwork and had it surveyed and mapped out, a city named after him. Now, of course, there are many cities named after him. The name Iskenderun is also the same as Alexandretta. Alexandria, the name Iskander is the Oriental way of saying, particularly in the Arabic-speaking world, the word Alexander. Skander or Iskander. But this is Alexandria. This is the mother city. This is the city that he founded to be the world's first world city, cosmopolis. And it truly became the world's first world city after Persepolis. Persepolis was his model. Remember, 46 nations could come as vassal satrapies to Persepolis. So in some way, Alexandria is modeled after Persepolis. Alexandria brought so much to the world. I'm not going to go into all the details of it. For example, the Paradisa, if you speak Farsi, Paradisa is this enclosed garden of Persia that Cyrus had at Pasargadae. Alexander brings the Persian paradise garden back to the west. So paradisos is the Greek word for it. And of course, he founded the Library of Alexandria, or at least left plans to found it. And Ptolemy I, his successor there, did. Whether it had 300,000 or 400,000, or as some even say 700,000 scrolls, it was the world's largest repository of intellectual knowledge, probably in history to that time. Now, Alexander went on, as I said, and then the Battle of Gaugamela, 331, he's chasing Darius III all the way across, so from Babylon, where he's welcomed into Babylon. They open the gates of Ishtar, and he's welcomed. No struggle. Goes to Susa, chases Darius to Persepolis, to Ecbatana, all the way across Media to Parthia, under the Elbrus Mountains and under the desert. He basically avoids the Dashti Desert, a wise thing to do, but chases Darius III all the way over to Bactria, and finally, he finds Darius dying because he's been attacked. People who turned Darius, turned against Darius. Darius is probably spending the bulk of his treasure paying for his safe passage, and it dwindles down to almost nothing. And he's finally killed. And we're told either Darius dies in the arms of Alexander or was just dying before. But Alexander gave him a royal burial. We'll talk about the Oxus treasure. You can see the Oxus River here. And eventually Alexander goes all the way to India, fights with King Porus. We still don't know if he really won that battle or if it was a stalemate. But then he does something not very wise, comes down the Indus River and crosses the Gedrosian desert. And this is deadly. And a lot of his soldiers die. By now, Alexander's pretty worn out, too. Comes back to Persepolis. Thais, a concubine, a hetaira, says, let's pay back the Persians, at least the story says, for burning Athens. So they burn Persepolis in a drunken orgy. And then eventually Alexander comes back to Babylon. And, when Alexander dies, if you think of somebody dying at age 32, 33, completely dissipated, had all kinds of issues. He'd been so heavily wounded so many times that his body, his immune system, he probably was now also suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. For days as he was dying, his close circle of friends, the companions, didn't want to let the soldiers know. And when he finally dies, nobody believes it because he's supposed to be a god, even though they'd seen his dissipated and dissolute life. Alexander, by his last years, was impaling his close friends with spears. He was doing all kinds of things. He turned from this austere, self-controlled, generous person to a despot. And he was probably, as I said, by this time openly alcoholic. Maybe for pain, who knows. But here's his triumphal procession into Babylon. He visits the tomb of Cyrus the Great, and it had been kind of broken down. He had it repaired because he was very, very much an admirer of Cyrus the Great. He literally climbed in. It had already been robbed out by this time because it was now 300 years old, or 200 years old. But he repaired it, had it repainted, and so on. And now the Oxus treasure, which may be, although when I've spoken to John Curtis about this, the British Museum, he's not so certain. But the treasure that was found here in the Oxus River, I'm not going to go into all the detail. 170 objects, some of them going back to Cyrus, gathered together. It includes a lot of royal materials. It was probably found at the ferry station of Takhti Kuwad, and it was Captain Burton, a British officer in Afghanistan, who rescued these merchants who they said they'd been captured by bandits and so on, and they had found this treasure. So now they're at the British Museum, almost all of it. It's a little bit in the Victoria and Albert, but mostly in the British Museum. And it's a royal treasure, there's no doubt about it. Here's a silver bowl of Artaxerxes. Here's a silver rhyton. Here's a gold and silver bowl with appliques, vermeil. Here's a silver wine cup. It has an inscription on the side you can just barely see right there. There's the inscription, which again says, I belong to Xerxes. A lot of gold treasures. Here's a griffin. Here's a dark gold coin showing a Persian king running with a bow and a scepter. Here's a Median, probably a priest. You see the Median cap. Later this becomes a Phrygian cap. Here's another silver rhyton. Here's a beautiful chariot. It's about this big, made of gold and gold wire. So it's an enormously valuable treasure. Gold jugs. Here's a winged stag. Some of this looks Scythian or Massageitan. Here are what are called barsam, liturgical figures for part of Zoroastrian rites. There's a ceremonial scabbard, an akinakis, possibly royal. It's gold sheathed over leather. Remember that there was also something like this in the Scythian form, Borsiros, that was in the tomb of his father Philip. But anyway, this appears to be a royal treasure. Griffin, this is a solid gold bracelet of griffins that was enameled. And it bends here at this kink, right here. Because it's soft gold, it bends and opens and closes, so you can put it on your wrist. It's very heavy. It's today in the British Museum. But the griffin was, in Persian mythology, the guardian of royal treasure. So there is still a debate whether this was the last treasure that Darius was hauling around being chased by Alexander. There's still this possibility that this is the last bit he has to pay for his safe passage as he's fleeing from Alexander, who is indeed unstoppable. And then one of the last acts, as I said, the burning of Persepolis. Persepolis had the Hall of 100 Columns, and if you know anything about Persian architecture, you can see some of this again. There are still fragments in it in the National Archaeology Museum of Tehran in Iran, which I saw recently, last year. But there was a lot of gold in Persepolis. A lot of gold on the ceiling, a lot of gold in the capitals, a lot of gold relief, detail. The gold shining at Persepolis was said to be the gold of the world. And some legends say that when Alexander and the Greeks, although Alexander wasn't necessarily the instigator, it was Thais, a courtesan, but it was said that when Persepolis burned, gold ran through the streets of Persepolis. Literally, molten gold. Whether or not that is true. But in this process, Alexander did indeed pay back the Persians for sacking Greece. However, his Macedonians wanted to go home. The Greeks wanted to go home. And Alexander wasn't letting that happen very easily. He was looking for something else. Hard to say, but now he's immobilized. And in his dying, that breaks essentially the blockage for those Greeks to go home. When they go home, lots of things change. His empire that he inherits is now split up between his generals. Ptolemy, his closest general friend, along with Hephaestion before him, Ptolemy goes back to Alexandria and sets up a new kingdom, the kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Some of the others go back, and Antigonus gets part of Macedon. Seleucus gets now Asia Minor. So his empire is divided up into competing groups. But look at the legacy now. That's essentially what he inherited. But what happens? This soon goes back to the Parthians. This is not retained by Alexander. It was a very short-lived empire, all of 12 years. And here in his battle with King Porus of India, this is when now the elephant comes into the imagination of the West. So elephants are now seen in Hellenistic art. And elephants are now bred in Syria. Asian elephants, Elephas maximus. They bring back elephants with them shortly. Now, Alexander's legacy, when you go to India, this is Indian sculpture, but it's westernized. Do you see it? The Gandharan sculpture that's a Western face on a Gandharan schist sculpture. So East meets West. This is what Hellenism is all about. This is part of Alexander's legacy. East comes back with the Greeks to the West. Now, think about part of the legacy of Alexander. Here, this is a Persian story. He's called Iskander and the Sage. It's the story of Diogenes. When Alexander is in Athens and he finds the cynical philosopher Diogenes, and Diogenes lives in a barrel. And he lives very austerely. And Alexander says, "Oh, Diogenes, what can I do for you?" And Diogenes says, "Just get out of the sunshine. You're blocking the light." That's a famous story. But here is the Persian version of it. And it's Iskander and the Sage. So let's go back to the Library of Alexandria. What happens as a result of the Library of Alexandria? Many great things happen. All the knowledge of the world is collected here. The Ptolemies say to the Greeks, they're Greek, but they say to the Greeks, would you please send us copies? Bring us Aeschylus and Sophocles' plays. Let's see the originals. We're going to copy them here, and we'll send you back the originals. Well, the Greeks said, no way. Ptolemy says, I'll give you 10,000 silver talents to just borrow them. Well, they send them, and what does Ptolemy do? Sends copies back, keeps the originals. Anyway, but look, what happens to the world? Ptolemy says to the Hebrews, to the Jews, we want your sacred scriptures. So he sets up this pact with 70 elders, 70 Jewish elders in Alexandria, and says, write out your scriptures in Greek so we can have those too. And they do. And hence we have the LXX. The 70 elders produce the Septuagint, the LXX. Septuaginta is 70 in Greek. So now we have the scriptures in Greek, the Hebrew scriptures. We also, think about this. These are two of the greatest mathematicians in the history of the world. It wouldn't be possible without Alexander going east, bringing back Babylonian mathematics, bringing back Persian astronomy. Because, you think about it, Archimedes and Euclid of Alexandria, they're post-Alexander. Do you see that? The best Greek mathematics comes after Alexander. The Pythagorean theorem was borrowed from Babylon earlier by Pythagoras. So think about the legacy of Alexander in this respect. Greek mathematics wouldn't be what it could be without Alexander bringing Hellenism about. And he encountered this stone. Now, it didn't look like this. He encountered this stone in the east. It was basically, Alexander loved it because it was the unconquerable stone. Damos is to conquer. Adamos means not conquerable. Adamos becomes adamant, adamantine, and eventually the word diamond. But at first, it was just for lapidary use. It was the hardest stone in the world to cut other stones. It's not until the Middle Ages that it becomes a gemstone in its own right. From, again, literally India and the Gupta, and then later the Safavids, and so on. But think about this legacy. Now let's stop. It's more than time to stop to take a break, and then we'll come back. So we're not done. So take a quick break. I took a slightly different break this time. Now, just a point of qualification, and I'm grateful, Terrence, for your sharing this. Were it not for the Macedonian mines of Pangaeus, Philip probably wouldn't have been able to finance a lot of his campaigns. Enormous reserves of precious metals, gold, etc. And this really underscores the fact that how do you pay for war? At some point you may have booty and loot, but not in the beginning to establish the phalanxes that he did. That Macedonian precious metal reserves really helped. And also, another point, and thank you, Terrence, for this too, Alexander had to play a pretty cautious line with his own people, with Greeks and Macedonians. These coins that show him as Heracles and that show him as Ammon are primarily not issued under, they're not issued under Alexander. There may be prototypes, but that's really difficult to prove. He's not going to claim too publicly that he's a god in front of his own people, because Greeks and Macedonians are not going to stomach that. Yes, he has to be proclaimed as Pharaoh, as a living god in Egypt, but the Greeks and Macedonians were fed up with him by his last couple of years, but that's more for his behavior. And there's still a debate whether or not he was poisoned. When Plutarch finishes his life of Alexander, he dismisses that theory. Some have even claimed that Aristotle was so upset at his protege that he sent a special concoction of poison with the help of Theophrastus to kill Alexander, and that's what eventually did it. But we'll never know if that's the case. We do know, however, that the Thracian, Ptolemaic, Lysimacheian coins that are used by Alexander's successors to legitimize their own rule are the ones that come out really frontal with his deification. But Alexander had to walk a very careful line with his own followers. He was happy to build up the legends of his unconquerable nature, but right now, as we speak, there are probably 10 or 15 offsetting lives of Alexander that go either too far one way or not far enough another, or they're somewhere in the middle and are balanced. Peter Green's book on Alexander still may be about the best. I would encourage you, if you want to read more about Alexander, read Plutarch's Life of Alexander. I think it's probably, for antiquity, it's probably the best source of his character. Now let's look at what happens after Alexander. I'm going to try to go through all these: the Ptolemaic era, the Seleucid kingdoms, two of his successors, the Seleucid kingdom in Asia Minor, Anatolia, and Syria, and so on, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, both of which claim control over Palestine. But as I said, Alexander produces the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures. And then you have a Seleucid king, the name today of Antakya, which was ancient Antioch. The rulers of the Seleucids, eventually, Antiochus IV, who called himself the one upon whom the gods showed favor. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. He did something very, very bad when they eventually, the Seleucids under Antiochus, took what was now the part of Palestine that was Judea, the old kingdom of Judea, and he took over Jerusalem, and he was very tyrannical in Jerusalem, and he forbade a lot of the Jews to worship there properly. So what he did was something very typically Greek. If you want to sacrifice animals, if you're a Greek, you sacrifice a bull, which is very expensive, or a heifer, but normally you sacrifice an animal that grows very fast and will eat anything and has lots of litters, and that's going to be a pig. Well, he evidently didn't have good counsel that day when he sacrificed a female pig, a sow, on the high altar of the temple in Jerusalem. That's not a very kosher thing to do. In fact, the outrage in Jerusalem was so bad that the Jerusalemites and the Jews called it the desolation of abomination, or abomination of desolation. And then they made a pact against the Seleucids. They looked for help against the Greeks. Now, the Greeks set up 10 cities in Palestine called the Decapolis, mostly on the east side of the Jordan. Scythopolis, Philadelphia, etc., etc. But the Maccabees, who were the rebels, the sons of Mattathias of Modin, they set up a pact with Rome, which is a dangerous thing to do. Because if you read 1 Maccabees 8, it suggests the Romans say, okay, we'll come to your aid, but now you're forever connected to us. And you have to help us when we're in need. You have to supply us with manpower. But if we are going to rescue you from the Greeks, this is going to be an unbreakable alliance. And if you break it, if you rebel, we're going to come down with our hobnailed boots hard on you. So essentially, the Romans set up a client kingdom, the Hasmonean dynasty, and then the first triumvirate, Pompey the Great, comes and takes Judea, and then a client king is set up, Herod, who's half Jewish and half Idumean. And he marries Mariamne, a Jewess, to claim kingship because she's the last descendant of the Hasmonean house. In the first term, now Herod, as you know, was a horrible husband and a horrible father, imprisoned and killed several wives, the same with many of his children, his sons, who he always was worried would usurp the throne. And Herod, as you probably know, was a paranoid of the worst order. He built all these fortresses and palaces in remote places. The Herodium, south of Bethlehem, Machaerus on the Jordan River plain. Actually, it's a plateau above the plain. He built, as you know, Masada into a fortress as well. Masada meant fortress anyway. But Herod was so bad. Now, he even sided in the second triumvirate with Antony, which was a bad thing to do. And he has to switch sides to Octavian Augustus after Antony loses. But Augustus said something. Augustus spoke good Greek. And the word for pig in Greek is huos. The word for son is huios. You see, it's only a one-letter difference, yes? The I inserted in for son. But pigs, Herod built the temple for the Jews, now what's called the second temple, or even the Herodian temple. It's not the intermediate temple under Ezra and Nehemiah, but the temple that he built to curry favor with his subjects as a client king of the Romans, not a true independent king of Judea, but Herod tries to live to please his Jewish subjects. So one of the things he does is stop eating pork. So Augustus, who knew well how bad a father and husband Herod was, said, it's safer to be Herod's pig than his son. It's safer to be his huos than his huios. He'll spare the pig, but he won't spare the son. Now, under the Greeks, who are now, because Greek becomes the lingua franca, Koine Greek becomes the lingua franca of the East, under the Ptolemies and Seleucids. And so now you have these new sects that develop in Judaism. Now, some of what I could say could be arguable, but you have the Pharisees, who are conservative as a sect, very strict about the law, and then you have the Greeks, who are Jews, but they're Hellenized Jews. They speak Greek, write Greek, and many of them have Greek names. In fact, a lot of the Sanhedrin, the council, of the Jews have Greek names. But the Sadducees are Hellenized Jews, and they're very literate and are scribal as well. So if you think of Pharisees as conservative Jews, who are more attuned to the law, and the Sadducees, who are lawyers and Greek-speaking Jews, they're Hellenized Jews. And then you have the ones who want to get rid of everybody, all the occupiers, and those are the Zelotes, the Zealots. There's a fourth sect that's very small, lives out in the desert, that are separatists, the Essenes. But these are the three major sects. Now, let's see what happens. So here is the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and a mock-up model right here. This is the Pelopian Mound. The Philippian is over here. And this is the built by Alcmenes in the 5th century. And this is where the great wonder of the world, the golden ivory statue of Phidias, was housed. Practically 40 feet tall, at least 36 feet tall, but seated. And there it is, at least what we think it looked like. It's gold over ivory sheathing on a wooden frame. And Phidias constructs it there. Actually, in the museum in Olympia, you can see the molds for the body parts that Phidias used of clay. I was just looking at them a few months ago. This was a statue. Remember, a statue in a temple, which is mostly going to be lit not by natural light, but by torchlight. You can imagine the flickering flames inside a temple. So it makes it look like the statue, this huge colossal statue of God, is breathing. So it adds some realism. Now this is one of the 7 wonders of the world at Olympia. But here, Antiochus Epiphanes, remember he calls himself Epiphanes. If you look right here, it says Basileos, King Antiochou, and then it says Epiphanu, the one upon whom the gods have shone. Epi, on, phanes, shone. So he believed the gods shone upon him, literally, and shined upon him, as well as showed themselves upon him. So Epiphanes. Well, after he sacrificed the pig on the altar at Jerusalem, a huge mistake. I mean, can you imagine making people more upset than doing that? After he did that, the Jews called him not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, the one upon whom madness is shining. Not Epiphanes, Epimanes. So there he is, but he did also do something else that was really bad in Jerusalem. Peter Levy, who's written a very good commentary on Pausanias, the Roman traveler of the mid-2nd century in the Common Era, CE, Pausanias describes when he was looking at the Temple of Olympia, he saw a trophy there that was an Eastern garment that had been a sacred object, like a curtain. Peter Levy suggests that Antiochus also stole the temple veil from Jerusalem and gave it as a votive object to Zeus at Olympia. So it's a possibility. And if so, it might even be the same temple veil that had gone to Babylon and back, or parts of it resewn. May have even been the same temple fragments that had been resewn from the original tabernacle. So this was an old sacred textile, very fine textile with gold and silver woven into it. And here, if Peter Levy's right, and nobody's argued against him, although it's kind of an argument from silence, because Pausanias doesn't describe in too much detail, other than it was a sacred object taken apparently from Jerusalem. So what could be more sacred than the temple veil? Well, here's the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. That's what all that's left of it today. One column standing, and that's even been replaced. An earthquake took it down. You can see the way the stones have tumbled. The earth moved north, and all the columns tumbled, and that's been put back up again by the Germans. But that's what's left of the Temple of Zeus, where the great 7 wonder of the world, the golden ivory statue, was. And that's probably where the temple veil went. Now, of course, long gone. Here's another coin remnant of Epiphanes IV, Antiochus. So he caused the rebellion of the Jews to get their independence. So the Hasmonean house. Here's the other possibility, because he also built this in Athens, the great Olympian Zeus temple. You can see it's east of the Acropolis. Here's another picture I took of it in March. Massive Corinthian temple built by Antiochus Epiphanes. So he built temples too for Zeus. He was a real worshiper of Zeus. But to sacrifice a pig on the altar, either he was politically incorrect or stupid, or just really, really, if either he was unaware, uninformed, and you can't imagine that. So he just must have been stupid. You can be informed and stupid, but he basically caused the Jews to have their independence. Now, the sons of Mattathias of Modin fought against the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, after Antiochus Epiphanes, including one of the generals, Timotheus. And so here the Jews are successful as rebels, as guerrilla warfare specialists, the Maccabeans. And Maccabeus means the hammerer. So that's the way he hammered his enemies. It's not a part of his name. It's an epithet. There is the Gustave Doré version. So Judas Maccabeus was a wonderful general, but of course it's his brothers who become the real founders of the house, of the Hasmonean house. And then here's the way that the Hasmonean house works. We're not going to go into all the detail, but the last person, you can't even read that anyway, the last one left standing of the Hasmonean house is Mariamne, whom Herod marries in order to secure the throne, to legitimize his hold. Now, he's half Jewish and half Edomite, but the Edomites were enemies of the Jews. But he is more Idumean. Some say he's not even half Jewish, that's only a claim that can be substantiated. But by marrying Mariamne, she's the official descendant of this royal house of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean house. So by marrying her, he now establishes his power. However, eventually he imprisons her and has her killed. So, this is Herod. Herod is the only thing that gives him the title of the Great is his building projects, including the temple. But he was not like, she was imprisoned in a tower. You can actually see Mariamne's tower in West Old Jerusalem. I used to live very close to it. Now, the Hasmonean dynasty controlled this much of Judea in the 1st century, and part of over the Jordan. But now, Pompey the Great comes in essentially around 60 and he reestablishes first, this is before Herod, Pompey the Great comes, and he's not well liked, but he reasserts Roman control. When you make that pact, when the Maccabees made that pact with Rome, Rome is going to come down and claim it, and eventually Pompey did. So then Pompey helps to set up. After Pompey, Herod comes into the picture. So that's post-Pompey. But look at the way the empire is divided here. This whole eastern half of the empire, which was also controlled by Antony in the second triumvirate, is Greek-speaking, as opposed to the western group, which is Latin-speaking. And you know what eventually this bifurcates into under Constantine. I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to talk about the first century of the Romans in Judea next week. But remember that Constantius and Constantius, remember that Constantius goes to Eboracum and marries a stable girl who's beautiful, and she's a Christian. And her name, of course, Helena. That's Constantine's mother. She's not Roman. She's Briton. But Constantine takes over eventually the Battle of the Maxentian Bridge against his cousin Maxentius, who is fully royal. Eventually, this is the division of the empire. This division of the empire, which is the Latin-speaking world and the Greek-speaking world. And what does Constantine do? Well, I've always enjoyed seeing this at the Capitoline Museum door there in Rome on the Capitoline Hill. When you walk in, you see this huge, these fragments of a colossal statue that must have been 40 feet tall of Constantine. My students, my younger undergraduate students, say, well, they think that looks like Sylvester Stallone. But the way that Rome has reestablished this, it may be kind of accidental that Constantine's finger is sort of pointing to heaven, as if he's, well, this may sound heretical, but is Constantine really a Christian? We'll talk about that next week a bit. But Constantine does divide the empire along, because he resets he goes to Byzantium, and now has his city, the city of Constantine, Constantinople. And so this is officially the preference for the Greek-speaking world, and that's the division along which later East and West church schism and so on also happens, Orthodox versus Roman Catholic. But now what happens? Well, Jerome is down here in Bethlehem. Jerome is translating the Greek Septuagint and the Greek New Testament into what kind of Latin? The Vulgate means what? The common tongue. But by now, Latin, there are no great rhetors, there are no great scholars speaking Latin. It's dumbed down. It's baby Latin. It's like kindergarten Latin. The Vulgate may not really be a translation. It may be a paraphrase. I'm just going to sort of issue that because the Vulgate has dominated the West for a long time, at least until the fall of Constantinople, 1453, when the Greeks left Constantinople and came to Florence, where Lorenzo the Magnificent housed them in the Laurentian Library, and also slightly before that, 1492, when the Jews were kicked out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella, they went to Portugal, and then from Lisbon they went to Amsterdam. Erasmus of Rotterdam now has access to Hebrew, and he has access to Greek. So he doesn't need Latin anymore. He doesn't need this paraphrase called the Vulgate. And hence, you have big changes going on with biblical scholarship. But if you read Jerome's Vulgate, you will see that Jerome's Vulgate is baby Latin. It's not adult Latin, because nobody speaks adult Latin except Jerome. And he's doing this in the Eastern Greek world. So it's a fascinating story. I'll come back to this. And when we pick up next week, remind me to talk about some of the translation difficulties that we have because of the Latin. It's the Latin derived from the Vulgate is, when you learn Latin, classical Latin, it's the easiest Latin in the world to read. It's baby Latin. And it does create some interesting issues for translation. But I've given you a huge spread today, but I had to do this so that when we come back next week, we'll look at some of the things in the New Testament, including the Aramaization, and why some of the things that Jesus said make much more sense in Aramaized Hebrew and Aramaic than they do in Greek. That's a teaser. See you next week.